Water conflicts play a huge role in shaping history around the world. One of these global disagreements happened not too long ago. The Colorado River dispute began in the late 19th century and continues to play a role in life in the American Southwest even today. I'm Hannah Dzikowski, and with me today is Kirk Allison. Together, we are going to jump into this fascinating dispute and learn how the history of yesterday shapes the lives of today. So, Kirk, before we begin our discussion on the dispute surrounding the Colorado River, could you delve into the geography of the river and the importance it has on the people of the American Southwest?
Yes, the Colorado River runs from La Padre Lake all the way to the Gulf of California. The Colorado River Basin lies in Utah, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, California, and even into Mexico. It supports about 30 million people and 3.7 million acres of farmland. It is an imperative resource for the American Southwest.
Spanning 7 states, and the river being such a vital resource, conflicts seem inevitable. How did the dispute begin?
Well, of course there were no conflicts between the Native American tribes over the river. There were not too many people relying on the Colorado. However, when nations, such as the United States and Mexico, started developing, more and more people needed the river. They had a very first-come, first-served mentality. This worked until the river started to lose water. Now that their river is dying, the states are struggling to come up with a solution. Of course, you and I don't live anywhere near the Colorado, so joining us is Dr. Robert Adler, Dean of Law at the University of Utah. He can share some expertise on the dispute.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
So, Kirk, what are some new developments in the story of the Colorado River dispute?
Well, the water levels are still decreasing because of climate change, and we don't really know exactly how to fix it. Dr. Adler, however, mentions some ways this can be addressed.
So, the more important modern issue is climate change. And the models suggest that the Southwest is likely to get drier in the face of climate change. We are in the midst of a 15-year drought in the region and running. Some hydrologists or climatologists would argue that it's not really a drought, which is a temporary phenomenon, but really a longer-term change in the baseline hydrology in the region, and that as the region gets warmer, more of the precipitation will be rain than snow, which means less runoff into the river over time. And that means that the amount of water in the river is less than what we agreed to dole out in the combination of the Colorado River Compact and the treaty with Mexico. So there is what people call a structural deficit, meaning that there simply isn't enough water to meet the obligations that are set down on paper. So what do you do about that? The agreement that you referred to, the interim shortage guidelines, was a negotiated agreement between the states. There was also a component of agreement with Mexico in which parties were given an incentive to save water and to store it in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And so that was kind of a conservation incentive, which is kind of unique in Western water law. Because if you know anything about the prior appropriation doctrine in Western water law, it's use it or lose it. If you don't use your allocation, you typically lose it to the next junior appropriator in the river system. So this was a negotiated exception. Well, and as you can see, that doesn't give people much of an incentive to conserve. So this was an exception that gave the basin states and users within those states an incentive to save water, store it in the reservoir for even more arid conditions. That agreement is scheduled to expire in a few years. So the basin states are in the midst of new negotiations to try to figure out how to handle this in the future. And ultimately, the question is, can current water users save enough water through water conservation methods and water efficiency methods to overcome the expected declines in the river? And it's a very complex climatic system. which means that we can make some educated modeling predictions as to what the future might be, but the fact is that we don't really know. We can only guess.
Historically, in the United States, we know that Native Americans were not treated with fairness. How did they and their use of the river play a part in the Colorado River dispute?
Of course, the Colorado River was no exception. The settlers' idea of manifest destiny seeped into their management of the Colorado. The natives and even Mexico were not given any seats at the table of discussion.
So, specifically, with the Colorado River dispute, one of the things we noticed was that a lot of the conflicts that were happening were behind closed doors, so to speak, and that the public wasn't really aware that there was an issue until the water levels in Lake Mead, for example, started dropping noticeably. Since then, has the public been involved in the advocacy and resolution of the dispute? And if so, how have they been?
So that's a really good question. When the 7 Colorado River basin states first began to negotiate over the river, this is back in the 19-teens and 1920s, it was really all done through representatives of the state governors with some assistance from the federal government. It was well before the era in which we had extensive public participation in environmental matters, and the Colorado River Compact was essentially a closed-doors deal negotiated in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But then it had to be ratified by the different states. And in some of the states, it was simple. It was a good deal, and the states took it. But in Arizona, there was actually quite a bit of public controversy over it, and they elected a new governor who opposed the deal that had been struck by the original governor. So way back in the 1920s, there was intensive public interest. But the compact gave all of the power to regulate the river to the states and to the U.S. Department of Interior, and there really wasn't very much of a public role. So that kind of history and tradition of keeping the general public out of the discussions has remained to a large extent to this day. They also kept out of the discussions Indian tribes who were affected by the negotiations, and many of whom live along the river, and they kept out of the discussions the Republic of Mexico, into which the Colorado flows. So in the ensuing decades, they had to modify the arrangements significantly to account for the interests of those who were left out of the original deal. If you come up to the modern day, there are public processes by which the public can comment on different arrangements to manage the river, but there aren't direct seats at the table for representatives of, say, environmental groups or Native American groups.
Are there ways that we could involve the public in that way? How would we go about doing that?
So there are some aspects of river management that involve advisory groups. So, for example, there's a Glen Canyon Dam adaptive management program, which is designed to try to restore components of the ecosystem downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. And environmental groups and native groups and fishing groups and so forth are representative in those advisory committees. So that kind of participation could be expanded. I'm part of a group of academics that has advocated for a basin-wide commission, similar to what we have for, say, the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes, in which there is more considered public involvement throughout the entire basin and not just for these small segments of the river that are subject to particular programs. So I would advocate for a basin-wide management approach in which members of the public had at least advisory and public participation roles in the process.
So when did the Colorado River dispute go from a fight between the American states to a global issue?
Number one, the United States was more powerful in terms of military and economic power, and we're talking about the early decades of the 20th century, so it's kind of hard to think about it from a 21st century geopolitical perspective. Mexico, during part of this time, was in the midst of a civil war. But I'd say the main reason is that at that time, the upstream country controlled the water. If you built dams above the border, you could prevent water from flowing downstream. And this is a problem in international water law around the world. And then the downstream country, short of very significant international pressure or military action, can't say much about it. So what happened in World War II? The theory is that the United States was concerned about an invasion of the West Coast. There were rumors that Mexico might ally itself with Germany. And so the United States actually had a powerful incentive to come to terms with Mexico, not only regarding the Colorado, but regarding the Rio Grande River and other border water resources. So Mexico all of a sudden had more bargaining leverage.
So we know quantity of water was an issue, but what about quality?
It took until the 1940s, during World War II, for the United States to negotiate a treaty with Mexico to guarantee that Mexico would get some share of the river. Many people think it was an unfair deal. They're guaranteed 1.5 million acre feet a year of water out of, just roughly 15 million acre feet a year of water flowing down the river. Mm-hmm. But it is a binding treaty that now at least guarantees that Mexico will get some water for their cities and agriculture south of the border. That treaty also involves extensive involvement by the International Water and Border Commission. And they have amended or modified the treaty many times over the years to address issues like salinity, water quality, what happens in the event of a drought, on how the two countries will cooperate in that regard. And, most people think it's been a fairly workable agreement and a fairly amicable implementation of the treaty.
We've been talking a lot about historical events, but with issues like climate change and water quality looming on the horizon, what do conservation efforts look like today?
So it depends on who the users are and where. If you're talking about major urban users like Los Angeles and Salt Lake City and Phoenix, a combination of things like xeriscaping to stop using water to irrigate bluegrass lawns that really don't belong in the Southwest, indoor plumbing, conservation fixtures, and so forth. And that can save a certain amount of water. But the fact is that the vast majority of water use in the West is for agriculture and for ranching. It's used to grow crops, irrigated crops. It's used to grow hay for livestock. And so that's the bigger opportunity to save water. You can do that, again, through technology, for example, by changing from flood irrigation, which is extremely wasteful, to sprinklers or to drip irrigation. You can do it by fallowing lands, lands that are irrigating crops that are not highly productive. So you might actually pay farmers to not grow a crop in a particular area. And there have been examples in which some of the thirsty cities have paid farmers to not farm. And the rationale is that it might cost the city less to get that water than it would to, for example, build a desalination plant in Southern California. And yet the farmers might make as much money by selling their conserved water as they would by selling a low-value crop from that area. So water trades, fallowing, changes to higher water efficiency crops that don't use as much water. Those are some examples of ways you can conserve water in the Southwest.
Dr. Adler mentioned some ways farmers and other people can conserve water, but governments are also trying to conserve the river through legislation. These states cannot afford to be greedy with their water, lest the river becomes depleted and no one has enough water to use.
Water. Quality access in the future is an important global issue that today's generation must bring awareness to, and the Colorado River dispute is no exception. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you've learned something new and inspired you to learn even more about water conflicts happening around the world.